Remember those extra 5 months I bought myself by being ahead of schedule with Injustice 2? Yeah, I'm buying some more now. I know Armageddon was a midway title from before NetherRealm even existed, but only a handful of pedantic losers pulled me up on doing this with DCU, so I think I'll be okay with this one. As always, no cheap shots or one-taps, only when an actual exchange of blows occurs does it count. I'll be a little more lax than usual given how few fights there are, but I'm not counting Lee May's impalement or dude slipping on vomit. And no, I'm not counting MK9's intro either, it's not part of this story. We're going alphabetically this time, let's go. Ashra finishes no fights. Off to a great start. Baraka defeats Kung Lao, that's 1-0. Blaze loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Borai Cho loses to Shiva, that's 0-1. Chameleon has no fights. Cyrax finishes no fights. Dagon loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Dairu finishes no fights. Darius finishes no fights. Dramin loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Ermac finishes no fights. Frost loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Fujin loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Goro loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Havoc loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Hotaru finishes no fights. Su Hao finishes no fights. Jade finishes no fights. Jarek finishes no fights. Jax finishes no fights. Johnny Cage finishes no fights. Cabal loses to Taven and loses to Striker, that's 0-2. Kai finishes no fights. Kano loses to Katana, that's 0-1. Kenshi loses to Quan Chi, that's 0-1. Chameleon has no fights. Kintaro loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Kira finishes no fights. Katana defeats Kano, that's 1-0. Cobra loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Kung Lao loses to Baraka, that's 0-1. Li Mei defeats Shinnok and loses to Taven, that's 1-1. Liu Kang loses to Shang Tsung, that's 0-1. Movado loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Meat has no fights. Melina defeats Shujinko off screen and loses to Taven, that's 1-1. Mocap has no fights. Moloch has no fights. Motaro has no fights. Noob Saibot defeats Sub-Zero and loses to Taven, that's 1-1. Nightwolf finishes no fights. Natara finishes no fights. Onaga finishes no fights. Quan Chi defeats Kenshi, that's 1-0. Raiden loses to Taven and defeats Shinnok, that's 1-1. Rain loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Reiko loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Reptile loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Serena loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Scorpion loses to Taven and loses to Sub-Zero, that's 0-2. Man, he does not do well in the midway games. Sector loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Shang Tsung defeats Liu Kang, that's 1-0. Shao Kahn finishes no fights. Shiva loses to Taven and defeats Borai Cho, that's 1-1. Shinnok loses to Li Mei and loses to Raiden, that's 0-2. Shujinko loses to Melina off screen, that's 0-1. Sindel finishes no fights. Smoke loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Sonya Blade loses to Taven, that's 0-1. Striker defeats Cabal, that's 1-0. Sub-Zero loses to Taven, loses to Noob Saibot, and defeats Scorpion, that's 1-2. Tanya finishes no fights. Taven defeats Cobra, defeats Cabal, defeats Sector, defeats Sonya, defeats Wu-Lei, defeats Rain, defeats Frost, defeats Sub-Zero, defeats Smoke, defeats Noob Saibot, defeats Fujin, defeats Movado, defeats Serena, Kia and Jataka, defeats Reptile, defeats Dramin, defeats Li Mei, defeats Havoc, defeats Shiva, defeats Kintaro, defeats Melina, defeats the Shao Kahn statue, defeats Goro, defeats Reiko, defeats Raiden, defeats Scorpion, defeats Dagon, and defeats Blaze. That's 29-0. Now comes the part where we look over the data to reach some fun conclusions. The fighter with the most fights is Taven with 29. Second place is Sub-Zero with 3. The fighters with the least fights are Meat, Chameleon, Moloch, and Motaro with 0 each. There are no overdone matchups this time since no matchups repeat, so we'll give it to Scorpion and Sub-Zero because it was getting old in 2006 and it's only gotten worse since. The fighter with the most wins is Taven with 29. The fighters with the least wins are fucking basically everyone with 0. The fighters with the most losses are Cabal, Scorpion, Shinnok, and Sub-Zero with 2 each. The fighters with the least losses, counting only those with results, are Baraka, Quan Chi, Shang Tsung, Striker, and Taven with 0 each. The strongest ratio is Taven's 29-0. Other than that, it's 1-0. The most balanced ratio is 1-to-1, shared by Li Mei, Melina, Noob Saibot, Raiden, and Shiva. The weakest ratio is 0-to-2, shared by Cabal, Scorpion, and Shinnok. So our final conclusion is that Taven is the winner of Mortal Kombat Armageddon, having the strongest ratio, most wins, and 0 losses. Shocker. The biggest losers are Cabal and Scorpion, who each lost twice and never won. Shinnok has plausible deniability with the claim that one of those losses was a clone and not actually him, but the other two have no such excuse. Realistically, the next episode should be MK11, but I've earned myself an extra 8 months on top of the usual 8 months and the extra few I gained from being early with Injustice 2, so see you all in a year and a half. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? You get early access to new videos for just $1 a month. If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended video is Mortal Kombat's most controversial ending, Armageddon, by Evan Helbling. It's a humorous summary of Conquest Mode and not the only MK video on the channel.